Hi, everyone, and welcome to our Nuts.com Hangout, Healthy Holiday Baking with Adrienne Urban. Thanks for joining us. My name's Megan Remedios, and I'm the Marketing Associate at Nuts.com. We're excited to have Adrienne with us today. She's the creator of the website WholeNewMom.com, and her mission is to empower you to be your healthiest inside and out, and to help you do that without breaking your budget or losing your mind. Today, Adrienne will be sharing some of her healthy holiday baking tips and tricks, and she'll also be talking about how to modify recipes for special diets and much more. To give a quick introduction to Nuts.com, we're a third-generation family-owned business selling nuts, dried fruit, cooking and baking supplies, healthy snacks, and more. Over 3,000 products in all. So before we begin, you can submit questions through our Q&A app, and we'll take a few of those to answer at the end. And we'll also be announcing the winner of our almond flour giveaway, so stay tuned for that at the end as well. So let's get started. Our first question for Adrienne is, what are some of your healthy holiday baking essentials?
Well, that has changed for me over the years, actually, because I used to be more of a low-fat oriented person, but now I'm not anymore. So most of the things that we lean on these days are, for those of us who are eating grains, we'll have whole grains only, but always gluten-free, because we've been learning a lot about gluten issues. Some of us in our family struggle more than others with that, but we've just decided to basically put the whole family gluten-free from everything we've been learning about it. So whole grains that I actually grind myself. I pretty rarely buy flours because I have a grinder and I can save a lot of money just grinding my own. And then we have a lot of nuts and seeds, and I will either buy some flours or I'll grind them myself. I will make nuts and seeds into butters, lots of coconut oil, coconut flour, and then I use low-carb sweeteners almost exclusively, although sometimes I'll lean on coconut sugar a little bit. And then I guess the one thing I would add on to that is we use a lot of shredded coconut, tons of it. In fact, we use that all the time, whether it's rolling a baked good in it, having it as an ingredient in it, or making coconut milk for baking.
Sounds great. And what are some ways that you can get kids involved in the holiday baking season?
Well, obviously, first thing you have to think about is that if kids are getting involved, it's going to take more time, and it's going to be a little more messy than if you were going to do it yourself, although I can be kind of messy in the kitchen myself. But so one of the first tips I would have is lessen your expectations and realize that, and widen your amount of time that you've got available, because it's going to take a lot more time if you're letting kids actually measure, scoop things out, roll, pat, make the cookies themselves. And you also need to have a pretty big area because they need a lot more room to get something done than an adult might, because they're probably a little bit, not as neat as we are. I also, I tend to choose, when you're going to be working with kids, obviously, choose something that's easier. Like instead of a really intricate cookie, bar cookies are going to be easier because they can just slap them in the pan and they're done. But on the other hand, kids like it when they get to form things. So it's kind of a toss-up there. Maybe do some bar cookies, some things where they actually get to make something with their hands and do a shape and dip them in something, or put sprinkles or some kind of nut crumbs or nut pieces or coconut pieces on top of cookies. They really like that. So I think it would be a balance, do some that are going to be a little easier, and then some where they can actually get their hands in it and be a little creative and try all of it.
Those are great suggestions. So for your, what are your favorite holiday dessert recipes, and some ways to make them healthier?
Well, things that I liked when I was little, really, we made so many Christmas cookies. It was pretty unbelievable. It was kind of the highlight of my year because I love to bake. I would come home from school, and if I got my homework done, baking was kind of the thing I did on the side as a fun thing. I'd bake with my friends when they came over, and so at Christmas, when I got to make a whole bunch of cookies, that was like the highlight of my baking for the whole year. So I really enjoyed. Well, my favorite that I have not I've made something close to it. As if you remember those peanut butter blossoms, you know, the peanut butter cookies with the Hershey Kiss on top. So those were my favorite, and I have done a healthier part of the bottom, but I have not made a milk chocolate yet. I've got a recipe for white chocolate chips and dark on my blog, but I haven't done a milk one yet, so you'd have to kind of settle for a dark chocolate or white chocolate blob on top of the peanut butter cookie to make it a similar one. Let me think about what other favorite ones. You know, basic chocolate chip cookies I like. I enjoy truffles. So I used to make those before I was a whole foodie. I would make them as gifts and put them in a little box and give them out. And I actually about 2 months ago put a new recipe for chocolate truffles on my site that's totally healthy. It's all cocoa powder and avocado and vanilla, and I think there's a little chipotle or cayenne in there for a kick. So basically, you know, what I try to do is if there's something in my mind that I like and I want to do and I want to make it healthier, I always swap out the sweeteners, swap out a high glycemic or, you know, granulated white sugar for, at the very least, sucanat or honey. And if you're like us and you're on a low-carb diet, we go for stevia. I will sometimes do xylitol or erythritol. I try and minimize those, or a palm sugar. And there's also things like Jerusalem artichoke. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, or yacon syrup. So those are sweeteners that are lower carb and easier on the blood sugar. We also, you know, the easiest swap if you're eating grains is to go from processed white flour, just go right for a whole grain flour. And if you're eating gluten, whole wheat is a great way to go, and it's easily substitutable. But if you're not eating gluten, then usually I have a post on gluten-free baking tips. You really want to mix up your flours. So in other words, you don't want to replace your all-purpose white flour with just white rice flour. It tends to be more crumbly, doesn't taste as good. So you really want to go for mixing, say, rice with a little millet or a little sorghum or buckwheat. And some people have go-to, you know, flour mixes that they like. I tend to not be so much of the iron chef in the kitchen, so I'll just throw together whatever I have in different proportions, and it usually works out pretty well. But you know, one of these days when I get a little bit more ambitious, maybe I'll come up with a blend that's just fabulous. The one thing I would say about gluten-free flour blends is to be careful about is people tend to lean a lot on white flours, and I tend not to do that. So you have to decide for your own health and your own family and your, you know, who you're making it for, if you're going to put in, say, a lot of tapioca starch or something like that. I tend to go the whole grain route and just keep it that way so that my kids don't expect that, you know, store-bought cookie flavor, and they get used to the whole grain flavor. And then the other thing that I get a little concerned about is a lot of the mixes have bean flours, and those, if the beans aren't processed properly, they can lead to a lot of gastrointestinal issues. So I personally am concerned about that. I know some people say they don't get effects, but some other people get a lot of intestinal distress eating that kind of an all-purpose flour.
Okay, well, thank you. That's a lot of great suggestions for the alternative flours, as well as some of the sugar alternatives, and those recipes that you mentioned earlier, we'll have to check those out. So what are some egg substitutes for people who maybe have egg allergies or who are vegan?
Sure. Well, we did not have eggs in our house for a long time because my oldest has a life-threatening food allergy to them. So the thing that was a go-to for us all the time was a powdered egg replacer, and you could buy it in a box by the company's Energy, I think, and then I ended up I found a recipe similar to it online and changed it a little bit, and it's on my site. So that is what I used almost all the time. The only issue with that is if you don't want to have starches in your diet, you would want to use something different, say like a flax egg or a chia egg or a gelatin egg. So those are the three most popular egg substitutes, but there are others you can use. It all depends on what you're going for. If you are going for something that has leavening in it, you're going to want something like the powdered egg substitute, or you're going to have to add extra baking powder or soda to get the rise in the baked good. If you're going for something that's just the, you know, to help the baked good stay together, then something like banana can work too. I think some people sometimes use tofu. I don't eat a lot of soy, but if you're looking for things that are binding, then you can go the other routes with things like even like a sweet potato could work. It's going to add sugar to the recipe, but you can still do it. So you have to keep that in mind when you're looking at egg substitutes, is what's the point of it in the recipe? Is it a binder? Is it something to add leavening? Or what's its purpose? And then you go from there in determining which one to use.
Okay, great. So for the gluten-free diets, you were talking earlier a little bit about the flours. So if someone has a traditional holiday recipe, are there any modifications they can make to it so that it will be suitable for gluten-free diets?
So to go to gluten-free, you can easily substitute gluten-free flours. They're not totally one-for-one, but that's why, like I said, I tend to do a blend of flours, and then I'll substitute them about one-for-one, and usually I come out with a pretty good result. If it's an all-purpose recipe and you can handle the starches, adding in some tapioca or arrowroot as part of that blend will make it a lot more like an all-purpose flour. The other thing is, when you do a gluten-free recipe and you make a regular recipe into gluten-free, you need to increase the leavening. Now, there was another blogger I heard from who said that she went the reverse and actually used less leavening, but that's not what I found. So I tend to need more leavening in my recipes. And also a couple other things you need to do is gluten-free flours, the final result tends to fall apart more easily. So making, say instead of a big loaf of banana bread, make several mini loaves, or instead of big cookies, make smaller cookies. Make things in smaller proportions so they tend to stick together better, and the final product looks a little nicer after you get it off your sheet or out of your pan. I'm trying to think what other things I've done for that. Those are the main things when baking, and sometimes you do have to alter the temperature of the oven. Right now I'm forgetting if you have to go up or down, but I think you have to go a little bit lower on a gluten-free baking good, and then it tends to work out better that way. And then one other thing is sometimes people like to use parchment. I would prefer one of those silicone baking mats, because parchment, you just keep using it and using it. From what I've read, the silicone mats tend to be pretty safe. So I think those are a good way to go, or a traditional baking stone is a lot easier than a regular cookie sheet to do gluten-free baking on.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, those are really great tips, and I think there's more of that on your blog at wholenewmom.com, so people can also check that out. Have you ever used health powders or superfoods in your baking to increase the nutritional content?
I have not done that much. I've done a little bit. I have tried a little bit of lucuma and a little bit of maca, and I have not a baked good, but it's a no-bake recipe for mint fudge on my site that is based in a seed or nut butter and coconut oil, and then we made it a little green to make it like the mint flavor, and I ended up trying a little bit of spirulina in it. And you have to be careful because spirulina's got a little bit of that fishy kind of sea taste, but if you just add a little bit of that or chlorella, then it adds to the color of the fudge without overpowering it with a different taste. So I've done that. What other ones have I done? That's about it for the superfoods. I have to say, I was surprised by the amount of goods you all have on your website, because when I looked on the superfoods tab, I was really overwhelmed. There were things I hadn't even heard of, and I thought I was fairly well versed in superfoods. So even though I don't use a ton of them in my baking, I've done things with smoothies and stuff, but I was really amazed at all that you have.
Yeah, we have a large selection over there. So earlier you were talking about like egg substitutes and for lactose intolerant and vegan diets. What are some other substitutes that people can use for like the milk, butter, and that kind of thing in holiday recipes?
Sure, and I guess to back up a second, I forgot about chia. So if you're doing a chia egg, obviously that's an easy superfood to add to any of your baked goods. So you're just doing it as an egg substitute. As far as the dairy, that's another allergy that my son has, so he's definitely allergic to that as well. So we have substituted for that for a long time. We've used coconut oil for baking instead of butter. I make my own seed and nut milks. We used to make rice milks, and now because it's a higher carb, we don't make that so much anymore. But I make coconut milk. Actually, I tend to not go the more difficult route of making it and then straining everything out in a nut bag. we just make it and use it as is. So it's I put that up on my site as well. I'm really busy. I mean, we homeschool, and the blog, it takes a lot of time, and I was coming out of adrenal fatigue, and it's a lot to run a Whole Foods kitchen and just to get food on the table. So that's what, when you said without losing your mind, I try and do things as easy as possible and remove as many steps as possible so we can eat healthily and not spend too much money and not be in the kitchen our whole lives. So the easiest coconut milk and easiest almond milk I have on my site, where it's super simple and makes it easy to replace those boxes from the grocery store and just get it on the table quickly.
Yeah. So where do you find the inspiration for your recipes, and particularly for your holiday treats?
Well, I used to look at magazines all the time, like cooking magazines, and I would get them in the mail and just pore over them and pick out new ideas. But pretty much these days, it's a couple of cookbooks that I have, or the internet. You know, I use Pinterest a little bit, or Google Plus. I love the foodies who are on Google Plus, and the amount of creativity, it just kind of boggles my mind. So even just today, I saw these grain-free pumpkin muffins that looked incredible, or trying to think what else I saw recently. Sometimes it's just something I see in the store. The other day we were shopping, and they were they had a pumpkin seed bark with dark chocolate, and I thought, oh, now that would be great to make at home. So it's really a variety. It's when I see something that really, you know, sparks my interest, I'll either bookmark it or put it on Pinterest, or I'll have a file in my Gmail where I put recipes that I want to try, and then most of them probably I never get back to, but there are some that are just so wonderful I go back and remember and try them, and my kids remind me too sometimes. If I show them a couple months later, a couple weeks later, they'll remind me and say, oh, can you make that, whatever we saw on the computer the other day? And so sometimes it's my kids clamoring for something that gets me to do something in the kitchen.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So now we're going to take a couple of questions from viewers. So one of the questions that came in is, what are some good recipes for the holidays that use almond flour?
Well, almond flour, I have not baked that much with it. I've done a little bit. There is a, I think it was on, I can't remember which. I think it was on another website on Delicious. I don't remember which one, but it was almond flour only, and then gelatin as a binder, and then had chocolate drizzle on top of it. I have mostly nut butter recipes on my site. I really need to branch out and do some more flour recipes. There's one that's a silk chocolate pie that's really, really good, but the picture, I will warn you, is terrible if anybody looks for it. It was put on there right about when I started blogging. I didn't have a good camera, didn't know what I was doing. The recipe tastes good, and the crust is amazing, and that's made out of almond flour, and I would think for the holidays you could serve that as a dessert, or you could make little mini tarts with it. I often, if I find a pie recipe online that I like and I want to make it grain-free, I'll just use that crust and then whatever the blogger put as the filling, and so I use that recipe quite a bit. And other recipes, I haven't done a lot of baking with almond flour because I find it to be harder to work with, but I would like to move more in that direction now that my son and I have both gone pretty much grain-free, so it's in the future for me is a lot more almond flour baking, I think.
Yeah, and to add to that, if you check out our blog at blog.nuts.com, you can find some almond flour recipes there. We have one for a gluten-free apple crisp, and also some healthy vegan chocolate truffles. So you'll find a lot of like the gluten-free and vegan recipes on there. So another question we have is, what are some tips for converting traditional family recipes to low-carb recipes?
Well, if you want to make a recipe from traditional into low-carb, you want to go for, first you've got to, actually hang on 1 second. Hun? You've got to be quiet. You first want to work on your sweeteners. That's the most obvious one to go for. So you want to pull out the maple sugar, the maple syrup, the honey, the granulated sugar, and go for something lower glycemic. When we first started being more whole foodie, I first went to honey, and then I felt like that was really impacting our blood sugar a little too much, so then we went to sucanat. And that, if I remember correctly, the glycemic index is about 80 out of 100, where honey is about 100. Then if you need to go even lower than that, coconut sugar and palm are about a 40, and beneath that, then xylitol and erythritol and stevia are zeros. And in fact, there's a lot of data that shows that stevia even helps you lower your blood sugar. There's some data that says it can cause hypoglycemia in people, but I did a lot of research on it, wrote a post about it, and it actually looks like it might even help balance either too high or too low blood sugar, so it's a really nice option for almost anyone. In fact, I had hypoglycemia and started using even more stevia, not knowing anyone had ever said that, and my hypoglycemia is gone now. So, so anyway, so I'm really thrilled with stevia. The other sweeteners would be Yacon syrup is really good, and the one I mentioned earlier, Jerusalem artichoke, is very hard to come by, but I think its glycemic index is a 6. And there's also Lohan. Do you sell that by any chance? Do you have that on your website?
Or that's not one of the alternative sweeteners we have.
So, so that one's probably not as easy to work with, but it's an option. So once you get the sweeteners substituted out, that's the biggest one because the sweeteners really impact your blood sugar a lot. And the next that's probably a close second is the grains. So some people think that grains don't affect your blood sugar as much, but actually things like puffed rice cereal have just as high of a glycemic index pretty much as honey. So people think that they're eating something that's a good healthy snack when actually it's like pumping sugar right into your stomach. So going after the grains and changing them from refined white flours into a whole grain will help. And if you need to get rid of the grains totally, then it would be moving completely away and going for, say, a nut or seed-based flour or a coconut flour. The issue with that is that when you switch from a regular traditional recipe to an almond flour, nut flour recipe, it does take some coordinating, and you've got to really work on it a bit. Like you need to add eggs or an egg replacer and add more of that, and you need to increase your leavening as well. And so it's you have to be willing to have some failures if you're going to try and change a traditional recipe to a completely low-carb recipe. But I've tried it, and some of them have worked out just fine. So when you're doing it, just keep a piece of paper with you and write down the proportions you're trying, so then when you hit on the success, you have the recipe written down for the future.
Hey, that's great. Well, thank you so much, Adrienne. Those were a lot of helpful tips for the holiday baking season, and especially for special diets. So yeah, thank you for that. And now we're going to announce the winner of our almond flour giveaway. So the winner is Jeannie Fowler. So congrats to Jeannie. You can check back on the Hangout page after this to claim your prize. And if you'd like to learn more about Adrienne, you can visit her website at wholenewmom.com. And for cooking and baking supplies, as well as healthy snacks and more, you can check out our website at Nuts.com. Thank you to everyone for joining us today, and a very special thank you to Adrienne.
Thank you. Bye.